Assalamu alaikum. Today you will learn about web technology using JSP and servlets in Java. So before moving on to any of the further topics, there is only one basic requirement for this tutorial. You need to know about the basic programming in Java. And along with that, let me inform you that this video is a theoretical video in which I will show you how JSP and servlets works in a web technology. Once we have covered the theoretical part of it, we will start with the coding part. So without any further ado, let's get started. So in order to understand how a web technology works, not only in Java but in any other programming language, you need to understand what is a client-server architecture, because the web technology itself is based on client-server architecture. Okay, so in a client-server architecture, there is a client and obviously there is a server. Now, what is a client? Client is a browser, for example, Chrome browser, Firefox browser, etc. And server is a computer that is located anywhere in the world which contains several applications. So when a client requests for a resource or file in the application, the server sends back a response in HTML page. In this case, the response would be the home page of Google search engine, right? Now, notice here this URL. This URL is nothing but the path to that particular resource. We will learn about this further in this video. So, now a client can make two types of request: static request and dynamic request. So, what are static requests? Static requests are those requests for which the file or the resource is already present on the server. So when you request a resource from the server gives back the resource back to the client. Now that resource or file can be HTML file, CSS file, image file, etc. So take an example. If you go to Microsoft.com website, you will get the same web page as any other user in the world, right? That web page does not change. But what is a dynamic request then? Now dynamic requests are those requests for which the web page or the resource is not present on the server. So the server generates a response and gives back to the client. For example, if you go to home page of Amazon.com, you will see different products listed over there. And if another user goes on Amazon.com, he will see different products listed over there, although the URL would be the same: Amazon.com/homepage, something like that. So that page is not already present on the server, or that file is not already present on the server. The server generates a response based on the data, based on your profile, your previous orders. It generates a web page based on those data and gives a response back in the form of an HTML page, right? So this is the difference between static request and dynamic request. So let's see how static request works. So inside a server, there is a Tomcat container. What is a Tomcat container? Tomcat container is a container that contains the application that has been deployed on the server. This application can have files, for example, HTML file, HTML page, and as a matter of fact, it can have multiple files. Okay. And also a Tomcat container can not only have one application, it can have multiple applications. Got it? Now the way the Tomcat handles one application is the same way it handles any other application that are there in the Tomcat. So if we learn how one application works, we can understand how any other application works inside a server. Okay. So when a client makes a request to a particular file, in this example, suppose there is a file called abc.html in application, the client makes a request to that file. The Tomcat takes the request, analyzes the request, and decides whether it is a static request or dynamic request. In this case, it is a static request. After that, the Tomcat generates two objects: request object and response object. And then the Tomcat locates the requested file that has been requested by the client. And all the data that has been requested goes to the response object. After that, a response is sent back to the client with all the data that it has requested. In this case, the client had requested for abc.html file and got the response for the same. Now that we have understood how a static request works, let's see how a dynamic request works. So in a dynamic request, the client makes a request for a resource. Now remember, in a dynamic request, the resource is not present on the server. So the server has to generate a response for the client. Okay. So in this example, we see the client has made a request for ABC resource. But as you can see over here, the ABC resource is not present in our application. So what happens? The Tomcat takes in the request, analyze the request, and see whether it is a static request or a dynamic request. In this case, it is a dynamic request because the resource is obviously not present on the application. So there is a deployment descriptor in our application which determines what to do with those dynamic requests. Now this deployment descriptor is nothing but an XML file. To be specific, it is a web.xml file. Don't worry about the annotations, we will cover that later. So this web.xml file is the same as deployment descriptor. So this web.xml file is called your deployment descriptor. This web.xml file is responsible for handling the dynamic request. When the Tomcat has generated the two objects, request and response object, the request object goes to a servlet. Now servlet is nothing but a Java class which takes the request and the response object, performs operations on them, and then returns the response. This servlet object over here takes the request, whatever request the client has made, and process that request and saves the data in the response object. After saving the data, a response is sent back to the client. Now see, the client is still getting a response even though the file or the resource was not present on the server. The servlet was the one that generated the response based on the code that it contains. Now you may ask, how did the servlet generated that response? Well, whatever we have written in the servlet code will be executed. Now you may ask, what type of processing does the servlet do? The servlet do exactly what you have written in the servlet Java class file. So this is a very simple and basic understanding of how web technology works in both scenarios. So let's see what we have covered up till now. We learned about how a web technology works based on a client-server architecture. We also understood the static and dynamic request a client can make. We saw how the functionality of a server works inside a Tomcat container. We also understood what is a deployment descriptor and how the control flow works for a static request and how the control flow works for a dynamic request. Now, like I said, we will cover the coding part of all this in the next video. So do subscribe for the update. Thank you.